Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone joining us today. And welcome to our IIASA public webinar. This is our sixth event in a series that highlights the fantastic work IIASA has to offer a public audience. IIASA conducts policy-oriented research into problems that are too large or too complex to be solved by a single country or academic discipline. Our researchers are using applied systems thinking to tackle the challenges facing our society, such as climate change, just societies, or natural resources management, just to name a few. They partner with other scientists, governments, and local entities to create a broad understanding of the problems that concern us all. They deliver important scientific information that is then used at different levels of government to make decisions about the future of our society. We believe that this information should be available to all. And we are also interested in new perspectives, which is why we've launched this series. It's a conversation with IIASA experts. I will be your moderator today. My name is Amanda Palazzo. So today I will be talking about women's empowerment in science with two other IIASA researchers who will take a gender view on climate change impacts and also look at the role of water and gender equality. I myself will then offer some thoughts on gender in agriculture and food security, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. First, I'd like to introduce you to my colleagues. Raya Muttarak is a principal research scholar here in our Mitigation and Sustainable Development Research Group of the Population and Just Societies program. She joined IIASA in 2011, and she's also a professor of demography at the University of Bologna. Her work focuses on the differential impacts of climate variability, looking at human health, migration, and child welfare. Hello, Raya.
Thanks so much, Amanda. So indeed, population play a central role when we talk about climate change, more the mitigation and adaptation. And later on, I will elaborate a little bit more why it is really important to consider the demographic heterogeneity when we think about climate actions. Thank you.
Welcome. I look forward to hearing from you in a little bit. I'd also like to introduce Ting Tang. Ting has a background in environmental science and eco-hydrology. She joined IIASA in 2017 and is now a research scholar in the Water Security Research Group in the Biodiversity and Natural Resources Program. Her work focuses on water quality towards integrated assessment of global water resources and the associated solution options. So hello, Ting, welcome.
Good afternoon, Amanda. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be part of this public webinar series, and very happy to bring some insight on the water and gender interlinkages and the differential responsibility, vulnerabilities, and decision making for women in water. Thanks.
Great, welcome, Ting. It will be really nice to hear from you about that in a little bit. So before we jump to the main topics, I'd also like to offer you a short biography about myself. So as I said, my name is Amanda Palazzo, and I have a background in resource economics, and I've been working at IIASA since 2012 as a research scholar. I work with the economic land use model called GLOBIOM, and my work is focused on looking at the impacts of global change on water, energy, land, and food. And I'm also the president of IIASA's Women in Science Club. This now brings us to our first topic today, which is empowering women in science. So to start, I want to talk about the representation of women in science. So currently, women make up about 45% of the STEM graduates, which is a share that has been growing in the past decades. However, women still make up only a third of those working in science. So before we can dive in to the reasons why women don't pursue or decide to leave careers in STEM, we have to take a look at the demographic data. So the map here on the left shows the share of women in science. So the darker the color, the higher the share. This figure shows us that in some places there are making great strides to close the gender gap in terms of headcounts, so bodies at desks, so to speak, with many countries in the Americas and in Europe and places in Africa with shares above 40%. However, what does this representation mean along a career path? So as an example, I present here on the right side the breakdown of researchers by research category and gender for researchers here at IIASA. IIASA is one of the institutions which collects and publishes this demographic data on their scientific staff in their annual reporting. At the bottom of this triangle are early career researchers, which you can see women are overrepresented. I should note that the relative height of each layer in this triangle represents the share of those researchers within the entire research community. The next level of research scholars, which you can see here are the bulk of IIASA's researchers, is where the first gender imbalances become quite clear, as only 26% of those researchers are women. And at the senior researcher and principal researcher levels, this share is less than 20%. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't have women at the top. In fact, our Director General, Lena Srivastava, presented to this series only 2 months back. The issue is that when we need to look critically and closely at the entire career path for scientists to understand the gender imbalances and balances at all levels and in all spaces. So the image here that I've highlighted in the middle is part of an ongoing conversation of what does gender bias mean in science. So children were asked to picture a scientist, and in most cases, they drew pictures of old men in lab coats with curly white hair. Outreach efforts that exposed school children to different kinds of scientists help them to inform a different understanding of what a scientist can look like. As you can see here, a woman. So the concept of the leaky pipeline, as it pertains to women represented at various career stages in science, is one that at one end of the pipe, you have a strong flow of water, so representing young, early career women engaged in STEM, but that over the course of their careers, due to cracks along the pipeline, women leave STEM or academia. Catherine Grogan's work reviewed existing literature on gender bias in STEM and identified some of the cracks along the pipeline. These cracks are often caused by biases or other barriers. Some include recommendation letters in hiring, problems in tenure, promotion, and funding processes. And she also looked at the underrepresentation in publishing, as well as the invited speakers. So when we think about gender bias and what that means, we ask ourselves, what can my institution or what can I as an individual do to combat these different barriers and biases? So institutions can work to create a gender diversity and inclusion plan like IIASA is working on that would collect and publish data on gender representation in all areas, so not just looking at headcounts. They can set clear and specific goals and guidelines, and they can identify and offer effective training in unconscious bias and effective hiring and retention strategies. They can work to improve their workplace environment for families, because making an institution work better for families benefits women and men. They could and should understand that the role that they play in creating visibility for researchers and do all they can to avoid having all male panels by inviting more women speakers and more minority speakers. So what can we do as individuals? As individuals, we can offer more support to early career researchers. We can decline invitations to all male panels and projects, and we can call out gender bias or discrimination in ourselves and in our colleagues, which is incredibly uncomfortable, but it is very necessary. And lastly, we can work to bring more people within our own networks, which include women and people of color. So I've discussed the underrepresentation of women in science and some of the barriers that the barriers that people face and what institutions and people can do. But now I want to talk a little bit about a bottom-up initiative started here at IIASA to build a network for women connected to science. So the IIASA's Women in Science Club came about following a visit with the former Finnish president, Halonen, who asked to talk with women researchers about her experiences breaking the glass ceiling and promoting gender equity. During the conversation, many of us realized that the challenges we were facing were not uniquely ours. And so we formed a club where we could discuss and offer each other advice on how to approach different challenges. I'm quite proud of our network and what we do for our members, as well as what we do for the institution. In our network, you'll find scientific and professional people connected to science who learn from each other's experiences and speak openly about the challenges they face, like sexual harassment, discrimination, imposter syndrome, work-life balances, toxic work relationships, and also loneliness. We host meet and greet lunchtime events to discuss, and we discuss trainings. We host trainings and topics such as that support career development, and we also have developed a mentoring program for our members. As a group, we have organized institution-wide scientific seminars where we bring in external women scientists and speakers to share their work. And we also participate as a stakeholder and offer our collective thoughts on different institutional activities. One of the things that I'm quite proud of is how we adapt our meetings and communication tools and forums for discussions to allow people to come together in a way that fits their life circumstances. We host meetings over lunch or in the evenings. We do virtual meetings. We use social media and email distribution lists. But of course, like any group, we face challenges, which is why we take those challenges as an opportunity to reevaluate our club objectives and goals. So I could talk about WISC probably for the rest of the hour, but I think I'll move on so that, but I'm happy to answer any more questions as they come up. So I've already talked about women in science, but I think it's relevant to address a bit of vocabulary before we continue. When we discuss gender, we mean that these are the social constructions and expectations that are set between men and women, which of course vary over lifetime and over different cultures and backgrounds. So what do we mean when we say that gender mainstreaming, and what does that actually look like in research? So gender mainstreaming is a strategy that aims to achieve gender equality. It involves not only creating equal opportunities for men and women in research, for example, within a team of a project, but also within the research content itself. It means incorporating gender into the research objectives and gender into the methodology. When we talk about gender mainstreaming, it's also important to note that it's not just for women or women's issues. Mainstreaming gender is also the effort to address in science the understanding of the different realities of different human beings. The graphic here shows a little bit about the ways in which gender can be mainstreamed both across the dimension of the research content, as well as in creating equal opportunities of the research being undertaken. Research that does not take into account gender on the assumption that the differences between men and women that it's not relevant to the research is considered gender blind. And this research runs the risk of coming to incorrect conclusions or failing to achieve the project outcomes. I believe that to address the gender dimension of research, gender needs to be considered as a variable within the research itself. So Raya, do you think that you can tell us a little bit more about what we would miss if we don't take gender into account in climate research? So for example, how does gender impact the differences between men and women's ability to adapt to climate change?
Yes, so I will elaborate this a bit more during my talk. So I would illustrate also why it can be problematic if we don't account for gender differences.
Great, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so this is the very point that I want to make, and Amanda has already given a very relevant introduction. So I just want to give an example just to illustrate why gender particularly why data on gender or sex disaggregated information is important, particularly for policy interventions or policy planning. So just this sort of image that I want to illustrate, it's about migration. Actually, when I was preparing the slide, I was trying to find the global data on do men migrate more than women or women migrate more. We tend to hear about the feminization of migration, but actually we don't have much information actually that do break down for us. So I was able to find some of the age and gender breakdown. For instance, on the left-hand side, you would see the it's gender differences in the asylum applicants to the EU. So that's the data in 2020. And what you're seeing here is the age and gender differences. So in the younger age, like 0 to, actually I don't see this well, to 13, and then the 65 and above. So we tend to have sort of slightly more female than male. But when we look at the asylum applicants, the younger adult age, so say from 14 to 64, so that's a working age population. So it's overwhelmingly men actually. The picture flip again, if you look at, for instance, the age and gender difference amongst migrants from the Philippines to the US in 2016. So in this particular subgroup of population, those from the Philippines migrating to the US, and it's overwhelmingly in our age group, more women than men. It may look simple, why just age and gender differences, but actually there's a lot of policy implications that's come with this, just a descriptive pattern, because for instance, what would be that educational attainment, labor market participation, the health implication, women or men of reproductive age would require also different type of access to reproductive health policy and so on. So it's really important now that we are facing the situation of refugees, also maybe from Ukraine and other countries. So it's really important to know, so who are amongst these migrants, men or women or what age, because the needs would be different, but we don't have much data on this actually. So that's just one example of why it is really important whenever we collect the data. Actually, the more partitioning one can do, like where are people from, what are the origins, the age, and maybe the health condition, level of education, occupation, all sort of things. But at least for demographers, at least age and gender are really, really important things. So then we can help to plan policy. So that's just one example that I want to highlight. And then that bring me also to the next point that I want to say about why demographic heterogeneity also matters when we look at climate-related action. Some of you may be familiar with the risk framework that have been presented by the IPCC. Typically, when we talk about climate risk or disaster risk is a function of three components. So exposure to natural hazard, for instance, and then vulnerability. So exposure, so for instance, if you think that there's an earthquake happen in a remote area, like in the desert where no one lived, so no population is exposed to that disaster, to that earthquake, it means there's no risk. But imagine if you have the people who are exposed to drought, for instance, but if the occupation of the people do not really depend on rainfall, for instance, if you work in the urban area, you work in the city, you work in as a white collar worker, work with your computer, so drought probably doesn't really affect your livelihood as much as people who work in agricultural sector. So there's a degree of vulnerability also varies by population subgroups. So and that makes the one component of risk. So people have to be exposed to it and have to be vulnerable. So not everyone is vulnerable to such a natural hazard in the same way. And also another component would be, yes, maybe a person is exposed and maybe is vulnerable or susceptible to that hazard, but different characteristics would have different capacities to cope with that. And these three things sort of reinforce with the gender inequality, gender differences, in a way that some in certain circumstances, so women may have less capacity to cope with, and because they have less capacity, so they have to endure more impact, and that reinforce once again the gender differentials or inequality in that relationship. So maybe it's even easier if I illustrate this picture of why gender differences should be considered when we talk about climate-related risk. And I'm trying to click, and here it comes. Yeah, so when we talk about gender differences in hazard exposure, so it really varies depending on what is your role in the society, or what are you engaged with. So typically on the left-hand side, we see the picture of floods event, and generally actually men die more, have higher mortality risk from floods and storms than women. It's like sort of most of the fatalities that come from flood and storms all across the world tend to be about 70% men of younger age. Why is that the case? So men tend to engage more in outdoor activities, both in terms of work, as you can see from the picture, right? Rescue workers tend to be more men than women. Or also leisure activities, so men tend to be more outdoor, and also a bit of on the risky behavior. Men also tend to have higher risky behavior than women. So then in this particular type of exposure to floods and storms, so it tend to be men are more exposed. But on the opposite, when we talk about indoor air pollution, for instance, in many countries, like in sub-Saharan Africa or in the South Asia, for instance, when people don't have clean cooking energy, and who do the cooking, it's tend to be women, and children also tend to stay with their mothers at home. So particularly in this particular case, when we talk about indoor air pollution, which has really substantial consequences to health, so it's really women and children particularly have much higher exposure. So this is really, again, very important to highlight the differences, because then if you want to make an intervention, so you can intervene targeting the group that is more have higher exposure. So we talk about exposure, then we go to, sorry, I'm doing the click, which doesn't work sometimes. Okay. But the gender difference is also in terms of vulnerability and coping capacity. And we can also break it down, that vulnerability, into sort of, I mean, we know that there's men and women have physiological, and also by age, not only by gender, the physiological and biological differences. So if we only focus on this, in the case of malnutrition, so malnutrition comes in two forms, actually. It can be undernutrition. For instance, a typical measure that people tend to use, like the UNICEF tend to use, is stunting and wasting. So stunting is when a child is too short for their age. So we have the average height that a child of 5 years old, for instance, should reach that height. But if they are stunted, then they're too short. And 38% of children in the world actually, and now with COVID and other events, and the undernutrition has been increased, in fact. Yeah, so 38% of children under 5 in the world are stunted. And also wasting is also another measurement of undernourishment. If we look only the gender differences in terms of biological and physiological differences, actually boys are much more stunted than girls. Why is that the case? Because physiologically, especially I'm talking about children aged under 5, so boys would require more calorie when they grow up. So they're more really susceptible when there's a shock. And also, yeah, boys tend to do more, engage in more physical activities than girls. So that's also, they need more calories. So they're much more susceptible. But in some countries like South Asia, like in India, for instance, generally, boys are more likely to be stunted than girls. But when in household experience floods events, so which affect the food security in the household, we also found actually that girls are catching up in terms of becoming undernourished in the same way as boys. But supposedly they shouldn't be, because physiologically they require less calorie and so on. But so there are some, on top of biological difference, the parents' probably gender preferences in maybe want to feed boys more than girls, that can make a difference in the intervention also. So that can be the case. So I just want to say that there's an interaction between the biological differences and also the socioeconomic conditions, which we have to always consider it together. So think about another example in terms of heat related vulnerability. So typically, because of different composition in the body mass or the muscles and fat and so on, so children and women tend to have a less ability, this is a biological part, to thermoregulate extreme temperature. So both the cold side and then the women have lower sweating capacity, for instance, compared to men. But that's only the biological difference. So it's already sort of okay, when we experience heat extreme, one could think that women may be slightly more susceptible, only biologically. But on top of that, we also know that people in the disadvantaged socioeconomic background, so with poor housing, poor insulation, for instance, people of lower level of education maybe have less knowledge what to do to cope with heat and so on. And people who live alone, which tend to be more women, because women survive longer also, so tend to live alone. So they are much more susceptible to heat related stress. So in this case, so there's an interaction between the two. So generally, one could think that when heat wave will strike, because we sort of know when and the duration roughly from the meteorological prediction, then one may think that the intervention, we should target people who live in a certain area, people of certain population characteristic, because certain subgroup of population would be more vulnerable. So that's so the idea why it is really important to consider not only gender itself, but also the interaction with different characters. And this would be my last point that I want to make, that many of, not only of my own work, but many of the work that the researchers IIASA have done also show that if we tackle gender inequalities, that also have a knock-on effect in the achievement of other dimensions of sustainable development goals, but including the climate action as well. Because if you think reducing gender inequality would be achieving better education, health, nutrition, employment, and also in terms of climate action, because that's give the women and also people of lower socioeconomic background, if you give people education, empower people, then they would know what to do, how to adapt, and have the capacity to adapt. So that's a really important point, that investing, thinking about giving access to land ownership for women, employment, because that enable people to work and earn and so on, would have a really empowering people to have the capacity to deal with climate issues. And also women tend to be more concerned about climate change than men, have higher risk perception, tend to recycle more and so on. So even in the mitigation side, and consume less meat, that's also another thing. So we may think that it can really help with climate actions on both way. And at this point, I would like to actually ask Ting, because Ting is an expert on water. I think this is also a very area that we be talking about too much water, sometimes too little water as well, in extreme events. And I am curious to hear also how gender inequality play a role here. Thank you.
Sorry, Ting, I think we still can't hear you. I think that there's maybe one of the mute buttons. Try again.
Do you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay. Super. Sorry.
Okay.
My screen is a bit frozen. Thanks a lot, Raya. And my first slide relates very much to the water being too much, that I want to use the flooding as an example of water-related disasters that differentially impact men and women, and due to the social and cultural roles of people in the society. So Raya has already touched upon this higher mortality rate for male in developed countries. In the United States and Europe, this is reported that 70% of flood-related deaths are in fact male. And Raya also mentioned the underlying reasons that's partly related to men being more in the rescue forces and being in outdoor activities, and also since most of the flood-related deaths in the developed settings are vehicle-related, this is also related with a lot of on the behavior of the drivers and risk-taking behavior of the drivers. While looking at the developing settings, this is completely different. The mortality risk has reported being more for females than male, and this is partly due to that women's restricted ability to avoid danger of flooding. That can be due to the female dress code in this in the cultural setting, or not knowing how to swim in particular cultural settings because they aren't supposed to expose their body, and also linked to responsibility of women in taking care of small children, which if they have to carry their children, they can't run as fast when there is a flash flood, for example. Another aspect to this is related to the clicking is not working perfectly. and the other aspect is relating to the woman to ensure household water supply. This is in case when there's low sufficient infrastructure to deliver drinking water to the households. So after flooding, oftentimes there is contamination of the drinking water sources, that's boreholes, wells, or surface water sources as well. And also in terms of waterborne diseases, that's typically also happening after flooding events. And woman has a role to ensure house water supply and also to take care of family members that fall sick. So all this aspect contributing for women being more vulnerable to flooding risks. I want to continue with the example of women being the household water collector when there's water security issues as an example to demonstrate the primary responsibility of women and girls in water management practices. UNICEF has estimated that 200 million hours has spent for women and girls fetching water every day. And an independent study of 24 sub-Saharan African countries showed that more than 60% of primary collectors of water that requires more than 30 minutes per day is in fact adult female, and adult male is only 18%. And the direct impact of that is there's limiting access of women and children in receiving education and professional training and other income generating activities. And the further up impact of that is women's voice and decision are a lot taken up in the society because they aren't earning income, they aren't getting professionally trained. Looking at another aspect, that's the vulnerability of women for water security issues. Here, I want to demonstrate the vulnerability using the poor access to wash. So that's water, sanitation, and hygiene. This figure that you see is throughout the life cycle of a woman and the different discrimination that a woman or girl can face. This figure is prepared by the UN Human Rights Office. I want to highlight only 2 points here. One is in case of water contamination, there are certain stages of a life of a person that are more vulnerable. This including during the infancy, during illness, during old age, and parenthood. Maybe for the infancy and old age, and illness, obviously this is linked to both men and women. But for the parenthood, so that's for the pregnancy part, this is mostly related to women. And because during this particular phases of a person, their immune system are less strong, so they are more prone to water pollution issues. They have more health burdens when there's contamination issues. Another example I want to illustrate is the menstruation of girls. When there's limited sanitation facilities, so there's low toilets, or the toilet is not in a safe place that girls feel comfortable to go to, then girls and women get pressure to drop out of school after they start menstruation, and also they suffer from psychological stresses and also increased risk of gender-based violence due to poor sanitation. So this is on the responsibility of women and girls and the vulnerability that's a bit disproportionately for the women and girls. But on the other side, in terms of really water management decisions and water policy decisions, the picture is very different. Here I'm showing an example of the IUCN environmental gender indexes. The indicator here is looking at the countries within different countries and looking at the gender focal points within the ministries. So the gender focal points is basically a person who ensures the different ministries comply with mandates and national guidelines in relation to gender. Here you see out of the 6 ministries, water is at least with a gender representation, or gender focal points in the ministry. And this is data for 2013. And if we look at data that's the latest published data by UN Water, the indicator is slightly different, but roughly in line, representing the government's or highest level of decision-making engagement of women. Here you see that only 26% of the 117 UN member states have actively pursuing gender mainstreaming in water resources management, and only 22% has actually high level of women participation in water policy and management processes. So that means women being actively consulted throughout the decision-making process, or women being part of the decision-making process themselves. So this gender is a woman's constrained role in decision-making and in water governance has a lot to do with the underlying under-recognition of women's role and women's knowledge of water resources themselves, and also constrained rights of women in accessing, for example, for land, which is a precondition for water access. And this leads to the constrained access to decision-making and water governance. And this, in fact, reinforces the gender inequality in the social and cultural norms. And if we really want to rebalance this constrained role of women in water governance and make it somewhat balanced with women's vulnerability and responsibility in the water sector, we would have to act at all levels. So that's including the household level and community level, recognizing women's knowledge and women's role in water management, and also at water management practices, policy makings. And by the end of the day, it's also very important for the social and cultural norms to change the social and cultural norms to recognize women and girls' voices, and including the any other marginalized and underrepresented groups. And this needs to happen systematically, not only in the water sector, but also in the climate parts that Raya has talked about, and also in the environment and natural resources part and agricultural sector. That's actually the next topic. Here, I want to bring in one aspect where the land and water are very strongly linked in terms of the gender aspect as well. I have mentioned that land ownership is a precondition for water access and use. This is in case the water is not provided by, for example, infrastructures of the government sector. Here I'm showing a result of FAO agenda and land rights database of 104 countries. You see that only 12.8% of the land ownership holder are in fact women. And this has large implication on women's access and rights for using water. So I want to invite back Amanda to give us more reflection on the gender and agriculture and gender food relations. Amanda, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Ting. I mean, I'm very happy that you brought up the issue of land rights and land tenure as it pertains to water, since, as you said, it's intimately linked with agriculture. Currently, there are about 15 countries in the world where women do not have equal ownership rights to property, and twice as many of those countries, daughters don't have equal inheritance rights. And as inheritance is one of the main ways in which people receive land, this is incredibly important. So if we estimate there are about 400 million women engaged in farming, and of course, even more employed in farming and agriculture in some way, this has huge implications. So, I mean, if we set aside the human rights issue of equality and land ownership, we can see that, of course, this disconnect between property rights and agriculture plays out in several different ways. So studies have shown that when women have strong property rights, they earn up to almost 4 times as much income as when they don't have strong property rights. Children are 35% less likely to be severely overweight. And women with strong property rights are more likely to have greater access to savings, and their families are more likely to invest in education. So it has knock-on effects. Women also face a lack of access to resources, and this is either from formal exclusion or from a lack of agency. So it's estimated that if the access to resources was equalized, such as access to credit, fertilizer, equipment, that this could increase farm production and agricultural yields up to 30%, which of course could have a small impact on the overall global production. But since that concentrated production is taking place on farm, this could have significant impacts on reducing food insecurity and reducing the number of malnourished people by an estimated 150 million people. Furthermore, studies have shown that strong property rights for women leads to more investments being made on the land, and those investments improve the sustainability and soil conservation, so as planting trees or leaving land fallow. So as Raya said, investing and giving women more agency actually has impacts on improving sustainability. And so, I mean, when there's no control over resources, there's a lot less incentive to apply these long-term strategies. So as I mentioned before, there's a large share of women employed or engaged in agriculture. It's quite significant worldwide. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's nearly 60%, and in South Asia, nearly 70% of women are engaged in agriculture. So women's livelihoods are tied to agriculture. I put these graphics here to talk a little bit about the division of labor for agricultural tasks, as some of it is totally almost split on gender lines. So the graphic here on the right offers some statistics about how 75% of smallholder farms weed by hand, and about 90% of that job is done by women. Children also are often taken out of school to participate in weeding. The graphic here on the left is talking about extension services. So extension services, they can offer farmers the ability to learn new skills, access new technologies, information about tools, and improving knowledge. However, women farmers account for only 5% of all the extension services offered in almost 100 countries. So this targeting is not just limited to extension services. 10% of the aid that goes to agriculture, only 10% of the aid that goes to agriculture actually goes to women. So many of these, and unfortunately, many of these programs and aid services are using research methods to identify farmers and examine the impacts of their programs. But if these policies and programs they take a gender blind approach, then they have and they will continue to miss women farmers as important and critical in the process. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about food security. So the graphic here on the left shows the breakdown of the global population and its food security status. So Raya talked a little bit about this already, about food insecurity and about malnutrition. So it's estimated that about 2.3 billion people face moderate to severe food insecurity, and 928 million people face severe food insecurity. And in all regions in the world, and nearly all regions of the world, women are disproportionately more food insecure than men in both of those categories. And in nearly all regions, women are disproportionately more food insecure. So food, as we know, food in many cultures is considered a women's issue. So procuring, preparing, cooking, and managing the food of the house is seen as women's work. And of course, this is on top of the additional unpaid care work that burden women. In all regions of the world, women perform anywhere from between 2 to 10 times more home care work than men. So some actually argue that accounting for this unpaid care work can actually help to better understand the gender gaps in the labor force participation, as well as some food insecurity issues. So here, the images that I have here are showing different kinds of unpaid care work that women are performing. So I want to talk a little bit about agency, and Ting mentioned this, and I think Raya also mentioned this, the issue of agency and how stereotyping affects food security for women. So the diagram that I'm showing here on the left shows the way in which improving the status of women improves the children's health outcomes. And as I said before, when women gain more agency and more control over the resources, such as the control over their time, or they have more time because they're not out collecting water, or because the home care work is shared between the partners, and if they have more control over the family budget, they make different choices about their own health and about the health of their families. And this, of course, is tied to pregnancy. So when women have more agency, or society gives women more agency, pregnant people have better access to healthcare and improved natal care, which leads to better birth outcomes and higher birth weights for their children. So this improved agency then, of course, ripples to better outcomes for infants and young adolescents. And we can see this in studies across the world. So the last thing I want to talk here about is briefly talk about the COVID pandemic and how it's shined a light onto some of these gendered issues. Though, of course, in most places, the lockdowns are ending or have ended. At the beginning of the pandemic, if we can recall, we saw the disproportional lockdown or the disproportional impact of lockdowns on certain kinds of people. So people that were primarily engaged in food services, in hospitality industries, and also people engaged in agriculture. So for example, we saw nomadic herders who are primarily men, agricultural farm workers, including migrant workers, and different people in the markets completely lose their incomes from one day to the next. Those lockdowns were eventually lifted for workers and other people in the food and hospitality industries. And in many countries, they were deemed essential workers. Okay, essential workers, but for most of them, they had only informal employment status, and then had no actual health protections or social protections. So, and some of these, and that's to say, some of these positions are also much more exposed to contracting the virus as they deal more face to face. So this is quite an interesting aspect, because some of these positions, and in some places in the world, these are specifically more one gender, so men or women are more exposed or less exposed. And one of the things that the pandemic also showed us was that the food crisis that we saw, or the food insecurity crisis that we saw, and we still can continue playing out, is that the employment crisis, so the rapid unemployment and the rapid loss of income showed us the extent to which vulnerable populations depended on their daily incomes and their informal employment status. And it also, for a lot of vulnerable people, it highlighted the need to increase these kinds of social protections and increase these different kinds of feeding programs that reached certain types of vulnerable groups. Of course, we could speak a lot more about this, and this work is ongoing to look at the impacts of the pandemic. But I wanted to touch a little bit about it because I think it was really highlighted in at least in the media about what these different gender impacts. And the last thing I want to say here about specifically about the employment crisis is that across the world, women lost much more employment than men did, and women are still now not regaining that employment back. So this is something that will continue to play out as we move forward. So today we heard a lot about gender and how it's, of course, securely within this nexus of food security, climate, and water. But of course, gender plays out in other issues as well, such as energy security. And we know that gender equality requires us to eliminate stereotypes and prejudices so that we can allow people to realize their full potentials. We've talked about how some of these solutions to overcome these challenges require gender-sensitive approaches or understanding the differentials of gender, and it requires transformational change. So how does an institution like IIASA, built on this foundation of systems analysis, take a gender perspective? Well, I think that IIASA is exactly the type of organization who can mainstream gender effectively into the research, because the principles of systems thinking tells us to look at these interlinkages within a bigger picture. So now I want to open this up to questions, and I think we've covered many of the topics. So maybe I can move to move to the questions. So the first question that I would have is for Raya. So maybe Raya, could you please add them to the chat? And I've gotten some already. Raya, do you think that you can talk to us a little bit more about how gender norms impact the differences between men and women's ability to adapt to climate change? Can you tell us a little bit more about what these gender norms actually tell us?
Actually, you also have already touched upon it in your talk, in the sense that if the gender norms prohibit or discourage women to accumulate the human capacity that can help in terms of adaptation to climate change and other things, then that could be a big barrier. So for instance, we talk a lot about education, employment, or access to land. And then these are all the both the human capital resources and also the economic resources that enable people to adapt and to cope with any type of changes, including the COVID-19 pandemic and so on. So in this sense, whatever gender norms, which can become a law as well, right? Amanda, you were talking also about the right to inherit and so on. Then that's really, really important to change this. So the differences, not only men and women, but whatever norms that prohibit people to have the sort of equal access to opportunities to acquire the human capital, I think that's really, really the key for adaptive capacity.
So great, thank you. I mean, I completely agree with you. So Ting, I have a question for you. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about the different solutions that you see that has been solutions either that in your own work or solutions that you've seen IIASA research coming out that how we can actually reduce some of these inequalities related to gender water. What are some real solutions that we can take up? Or that governments can take up, for example?
Yeah, I think there are very different levels and dimensions. I think some of them I perhaps already touched upon, and I think Raya and you touched upon as well. It's I see a very large role in changing the social and cultural norms. And this requires a lot of public education that Raya has talked about, and awareness rising. And this has to happen at all levels. It's not just like we are as researchers or as a government. A lot of this is very deeply rooted in the culture. And that change is not 1 day or 1 year, it's 1 or 2 generations. And that's a very good point. I think the changing the culture and acknowledging those when we see those gender stereotypes or we see those gender biases happening in ourselves and in others, that we, like I said, we call them out, but we also acknowledge that those are, for example, biases, and maybe those biases have been ingrained in us in such a way, or the cultural ways in which we've been taught to behave have changed the way that we have developed as individuals, and they are now ingrained a little bit in our personalities. So we have to try to separate what has become part of our personalities and who we are. Are women more likely to, are they kinder people, or is that just how society has made them become because of how they've been treated by society? So these are different questions, but that's a really, really good point. Thank you. We have another question. So this question was for me. It says, before COVID, the gender equality solutions provided by employers was providing more options of working from home, but the pandemic actually showed that this had an opposite effect for women. So I think this is a very interesting question, and I am not a human resources or business professional of understanding exactly how human capital can be managed, but in my understanding of at least talking to people, my anecdotal understanding of talking to people and what I've read about women in the pandemic is that you had a combination of women who were able to, work, families, men and women, being able to work from home, but you had this issue of no childcare or no school, that you added additional burdens onto people in those circumstances. So I think that it's a little hard to say that more flexible working options are bad for women. I think that you have to maybe take a look at what the conditions are that would allow women. I mean, I think there's plenty of studies. I don't have any here, but there's plenty of studies that say that women being able to have secure childcare give them the opportunity to be more productive and to earn a more income. So when we take away childcare, either because it's not safe to send children to school or because we don't have the capability of sending kids to school, that burden then falls back on women, unfortunately, because of the way that the societies operate. So I hope that answers that question. There's another question here. I think this question is for Raya. We see that there's a large gap in the experiences for women
in the global north and the global south. So how can we, how can the work done at IIASA with like taking a systems approach take into account these different experiences and I guess the different ways in which human beings operate for the global north and the global south. So not just gender differences, but also, I guess, more cultural differences. Maybe you can speak a little bit about this.
Well, actually, if we look at, I haven't seen that map before, Amanda, the one that you were showing by countries, actually, the proportion of female scientists. So it's not that clear cut that the global north, you have more female scientists than the global south. So I think the key is to, actually, the countries like Thailand, where I'm from, there quite a lot of women participate in the labor market, also in high position and so on. So I think what we have to unpack is what are the key sources of this either inequalities or differentials. So, and I think, Amanda, your point on, I think for instance, if you think about European countries, there's no barriers in terms of access to education or even preference in terms of, if you think about fertility preference, do you want more boys or girls? There's no differences in European countries, but still we may see that women are falling behind in terms of wage gap and other things in high position. So I think still the major differences is the family care and the childbearing and then so on, and then that could be something that one can still tackle. So that's probably the issues of European countries, and then we still have other type of countries where, as I just emphasize the same thing that we said again, like access to land, education, even driving a car, and that kind of thing. So that would be the unpacking and then tackling this. And then I think one thing that we trying a lot now in IIASA with our system analysis approach, it's so we tend to, in the past, looking at things, the connection between food, water, energy, and population in the aggregated levels, or sort of, because that's already quite hard to know the relationship between all of these factors. And now we are moving forward, trying harder. That's why you were saying the gender mainstreaming, it's important, is try to really disaggregate it, because we know that heterogeneity is important. It's quite complex to do it in a model because we don't have the so good baseline data, but we're tackling that. And I think in collaboration with sort of, in my program, we are more social scientists and we are trying hard from our side, and we have the interest also from the ecosystem. So Amanda's group, Ting group, and I think it's, we're trying harder, and I can foresee that there would be more changes also in the way we do science.
Yeah, I think, that's I think there's also a lot of learning to be done from other institutions that have looked very deeply in how mainstreaming gender in their research. So for example, the CGIAR has an incredible gender platform in which they've looked at a lot of different ways in which agriculture can contribute to gender equality, which is kind of flipping the question on its head. So I would, as I said before, we will share the slides, of course, and we're going to put a lot of the information on the event page. But I think that I would like to also acknowledge that there's a lot of learning that I've done from how other institutions have either taken the role of looking within themselves as how the institution takes into account gender in terms of the makeup of their researchers or their policies, but also in how they design policies or design research projects that can take a gender focus. So yeah, I think that's really great. Ting, I'm sorry, maybe I can leave you with if you have one last word that you would like to share with us, maybe about what brought you into thinking a little bit about the gender differences and specifically about water equality.
I was about to mention something else, but
yeah, please, no, please, anything. We're open.
I was about to mention the here we talk about gender, like in most cases when we showcase data is seen between men and women, boys and girls. But I think we also try to reflect that the gender equality or gender inequality issue is not only about women and men and girls with boys. It's about the social construction. It's more about social equality and gender equality is only a part of it. And it's all the underrepresented groups of the society that needs to be bring on board in whether it's in decision making or it's in their vulnerability, their responsibility, or in this disaster coping mechanisms in all dimensions. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an incredible point. And I don't want to add anything else because I would really like to end on that note. So I mean, thank you very much. That's a really great point. Let me see here. If I want to thank everybody for joining us today. As I said, a video of this webinar is going to be available on the IIASA website and also our YouTube channel. And we're going to share the links that have been mentioned in the talk, as well as some other resources that the three of us have put together, finding quite useful. So I hope you've learned something and discovered a little bit more about gender and science. And I want to thank Ting and Raya for joining me today here to talk about this. And also I want to thank my colleagues from the Communications and External Relations department for their support in making this webinar possible. And of course, I want to thank you guys, everyone for joining us again. We really count on your opinion to how to improve these future events. So if you could wait until after, there will be a survey that pops up in your browser after you leave this meeting. We hope to see you again at our next IIASA webinar, which is going to take place on April 27th. And I would like to encourage you to follow us on social media for different updates. So thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, Amanda, as well.